Okay, well, I'll just maybe talk a little bit about why I'm excited about the event and the voice space in general. I think it's really, this topic could probably fill the entire day. I mean, it's obvious that we're in an early stage of voice apps and the voice market in general. There's been some exciting things and a lot of activity around the various ecosystems. I think a good way to think about, the way I like to think about the voice market right now in terms of an analogy is it's kind of like the early stages of a party, okay? So everyone has had a drink or maybe even two. They're feeling kind of brave, and maybe they're trying out some of the jokes that they rehearsed before they went to the party to impress people. Sometimes the jokes work, sometimes they don't. Fast forward to today, and I think that's kind of what's happening in the voice application space. Companies are trying a lot of different approaches. There are various things being tried. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. And to go back to the party analogy, sometimes it feels like people were actually drinking during the development phase of the voice apps themselves. So anyway, that's why I'm really excited about the topic today. So I'm joined today by Noah Vadnai, VP of Product and User Experience at A&E Networks. Dave Grossman, Chief Creative Officer at Earplay. Jamie Hirschhorn, who oversees global product partnerships at Google for Google Assistant. And Elaine Lee, Senior Product Designer at eBay. So I would love to kick this off. We have had some conversations before the event, but I think a good place to start would be, you look at today, it's all about home speakers, smart speakers, smartphones. What does the development piece look like when things start to shift to cars and business scenarios?
Hello. Hello. Oh, there we go. Everything starts with design from my standpoint, and design changes when you move from platform to platform. A thing that I notice is the level of distraction that I can expect from the person who's going to be using my skill, and also the level of distraction that I can expect to kind of achieve with them, pull them away from what they're doing. So we actually started 5 years ago, and our original use case was mobile phones. And so we were imagining the person who was going to be using our stuff would be, could be a little closer if you need, was going to be like out on a bike, pushing a stroller or walking a dog, something like that. So we were going to try and really engage their brain. And then the next use case that came up was cars, and we started thinking about that, and it's like, okay, now we really don't want to be distracting people while they're driving a car, so we need to design the experience to be a lot more passive and have some ability to be ignored for a little while you're doing something complicated and to kind of keep itself live. And then Amazon Alexa and other voice assistant platforms came along, and that meant now we were dealing with someone in a house who might be washing the dishes or something like that. So we were kind of backtracking a little bit, like now we do want to distract them a little more, and we're looking at doing more experiences for families for when they've got it in the living room.
Sure. Hi guys, I can jump in from the Google perspective. So when we think about designing for different surfaces, we usually like to think conversation first. So as you can imagine, I think a big misnomer actually on the Google side is that the Assistant is Google Home. And the Assistant's largest footprint actually is on Android devices today, which is really interesting and good to keep in mind because it's not just voice only. It's tapping, it's texting, it's interacting via voice. So when we think about designing, we think about conversation first, and of course that takes many different forms. So when you're thinking about Android Auto, of course that's a very specific voice-reliant experience, which is a little bit different from something like smart displays, which we announced a few weeks ago at CES, which will have a much heavier reliance on actually speaking, but also interacting in a few different ways through tapping, et cetera. So I think the overarching goal here is that we actually are always thinking conversation first, though, and then the surfaces essentially take a second backseat.
Yeah, I would echo most of that too as well. When I was thinking about this question, was thinking about how we would user test as a content company primarily focused on video and TV, but we have other content areas. Like how would we solve problems for users in the car? And like right now, our user testing is sort of very. If we'll prototype a skill, for instance, we'll have somebody play the role of the device and sort of respond as if they were Alexa, and then have various people who have different approaches to solving that problem or want some information interact with it. So how would we do that if it's a vending machine or a car or some other weird surface that we haven't even thought of yet? So I think that's where a lot of the challenge will come in, is like, how do you get the context just right? And I don't know if we'll have a car in the office anytime soon that we'll be able to test with.
Yeah, I just want to add to what Jamie was saying about design conversation first. So for my experience, I've designed both for Facebook Messenger and Google Assistant, Google Home, and I found that designing voice first cuts through all the other unnecessary clutter that you might add within like a voice, like a surface kind of interface. So then if you can actually design voice first, then you get straight to the point, and then everything else is a little bit secondary and a little bit more supplemental.
So specific to cars, I think that one of the most useful things for voice in a car would be playing music, right? So you don't have to fiddle with your phone or turn the knobs on the radio. What are some of the other scenarios that could be useful in a car setting for voice?
Ordering coffee.
Oh, yeah.
Location-based information. So as you're moving through areas, we have an app for our history brand that is called History Here, that provides 10,000 points of interest that are based on historical locations. So that's something that we could provide contextually in a car or moving, wherever you're going. But how do you add the conversational aspect to that makes it more than just a one-way conversation?
We're basically making audio books that you talk to for like long car drives, and also stories to entertain your kids in the back.
So like a choose your own adventure kind of thing where you can actually interact with the story?
Yeah, a little bit like that, only imagine it was actually good. That would be the...
I don't actually have a car and haven't driven in a long time, living in the city and stuff, but I've always thought about actually not even using my voice, but when I go into, say, a Lyft or Uber, that it recognizes who I am and just plays the type of music that I would like without me actually using my voice to ask for the driver or whoever to play something that I like.
Excellent. Great. Well, as Artie mentioned, so far we're in the early stages here, and one of the popular use cases for these smart speakers is playing music. Games have emerged as kind of the most prevalent type of voice app. What's kind of the next breakthrough after games? Is there something that's sort of ready to pop in terms of being a developer opportunity?
Shopping.
I see it. I don't. I've tried to shop using my Alexa, and it ends up being a frustrating experience. But maybe that's just me.
That might be a design thing. I think people are still getting used to how to do things like shopping on a voice platform, and they're thinking of it in terms of like a shopping app, which is kind of the wrong way to think about it. You don't have any way to do menus or anything like that effectively, and what you really want is kind of a shopping clerk. You want a sales clerk who's going to kind of listen to you and give you a few recommendations, and I'm going to guess that's not what you're experiencing.
Well, usually it's because my kids are shouting while I'm ordering, so it's kind of...
I think shopping is one of those harder ones to tackle just because there's money involved and there's transactions and there's personal decisions to be made. So there needs to be first a relationship between the AI assistant, the voice assistant, and say the brands, for instance, like eBay or whoever the brand is. So after building that relationship, which takes some time as well, then I believe we can shop through voice very easily.
I can also say from the Google perspective, we're really doubling down in this area. It's really important from a sign-in perspective, we've learned. So Amazon, of course, once you're logged into the Amazon ecosystem, it's pretty easy for you to kind of jet around and play with games and do lots of these things. With Google, if you're actually interacting with a brand, let's say it's your favorite makeup brand or ordering food or something like that, we are really trying to make that seamless account login experience and make it much more seamless, much more transparent, a lot easier for people to use when they're actually communicating with specific brands. And we find that that's really important, especially you see everything that's going on today in terms of analytics and PII, and of course Google really cares about protecting user data, so we're taking a lot of strides in that area to make shopping a little bit more seamless as well on the platform.
And these are, so far they're, we're talking about talking to the assistant in this sort of ethereal, invisible space, but I think there's going to be a lot more of talking to your things in your apartment. There's the Internet of Things and the voice space are kind of colliding with each other, and we're heading, I think, towards this magical, like if you imagine the castle from Beauty and the Beast, where there are all these appliances that are sort of ready to listen to you and kind of do your bidding and make you coffee and these kinds of things. But then kind of when you turn your back, they're talking to each other, they're collaborating on larger tasks, they're like hosting a big dinner for you, and then maybe they're even, you know, kind of singing and dancing to entertain you. I'm gonna be doing that. And then, you know, maybe they're plotting behind your back to sort of hook you up with the person who's gonna change your life. So.
I mean, I think there's tons of cool stuff you can do with education as well. We're just starting to scratch the surface there. You know, we've been thinking a lot about, again, with our history brand, of how to make history interesting in this context. And there's lots of ways to do it. And you know, for audiences that maybe aren't as sophisticated with interacting with a computer, we already mentioned, you know, kids gravitate towards voice already. So this is a really interesting way, I think, for both kids who are just starting out with computing, as maybe as seniors as well, who kind of missed a lot of the computing generation. There's lots of interesting ways to use it for educational purposes, and I think we'll see a lot more of that.
I think there's also this element of things that you can do on assistants today. So something like news, where you can get a daily news brief from the Google Assistant today, but we're thinking through ways to make that actually much more integrated, much more interactive and exciting. So even things that you can do today on the Assistant, we're thinking of ways to take those things to the next level as well. So I would say that like some of these areas that seem tapped might not be as well.
So let's talk about skills, developer skills. Let's say you're a company that has a team that's been building mobile apps for many years. How hard is it to kind of move them over to voice? Is there a whole new skill set that needs to be learned? And I guess the broader question is the competition for talent in voice an issue now, and will it be in the future?
I think the skill set's totally different. When the people that we work with internally on the Assistant are VUI, so voice designers, whereas we used to work directly with graphical user designers. And I think it's definitely a different skill set. People are thinking voice first, using different kinds of tools like dialogue flow, which is something that a typical UX designer wouldn't necessarily be familiar with. I think it really is emerging a new set of developer skills, from my perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's different, but it's also, you're starting with a user problem, like, and the more you can empathize with that problem, the better you're going to be able to create a voice skill. So I do think there is a lot of transferable skills there, and in terms of just the platforms themselves right now, while there are new tools and Dialogflow API, there's, I think, still a lot of the commonality there. I don't know if that's been your experience, Dave.
Well, certainly the basic principles are the same. A good user experience designer should be able to make the switch. But a bunch of new questions are raised, like how do I distinguish between what is my UI and what is my experience? They're both sharing the same channel. It's just the voice coming at you. How do I let the user know when it's their turn to talk? Things like this. How do I keep their options small enough that they can stay in their brain long enough for them to use them? And these are all things that when you have some kind of a visual UI, if you're used to making games like me, you never had that problem before.
I think just from my experience as a designer, I came from the visual side. I came from actually like advertising and also just UI and visual design, but then kind of moved into this space of Slack bots and bots in general. And I did find a lot of transferable skills, but at the same time, I feel like engineers, designers, PMs, whoever's working in this space, I feel like if we can just use every kind of skills that we have just to hack on things and work through this new industry, this new space, we can create something. Like I think we can still learn a lot from everyone and just use our skills that we have right now, because it's so new right now.
Is finding talent an issue now, and do you expect it to be easier or harder in the future to find the sort of higher end abilities to build these apps?
I don't think it's so much about finding talent as just finding the sort of resources, at least in my organization, to justify the investment. I mean, everyone realizes this is a important new means of communication and hopefully entertainment from any network's perspective, but it's like, how do you justify the investment in people time? Because there really isn't clear ROI on it yet. So it's, that's been my challenge, is like, how do we carve out enough cycles to develop something meaningful, and then show, you know, what the potential is going forward.
And I can say from the platform side, there's a big onus on us, right, to also educate the developers that we work with as these tools are changing and the design flows are changing and the surfaces are changing. A lot of the onus is on us to educate not only developers on our tools, but also to educate consumers. So to your point earlier, just about knowing when to say something or knowing what to ask for, I can say from the Google perspective, like invocation queries today are very rigid. So you have to say, talk to X, like show me how to do X. And we're trying to also educate consumers in real time through talking at sessions like this, through having a presence at things like CES. And we're really trying to educate consumers to also feel comfortable with those kinds of changing nuances. So I think there's a few different pieces to that on our side as well.
Yeah, I don't think talent is hard to find. I think it's finding people who are willing to take those risks in this space and being able to like learn from what's going on, and also, like you were saying, teach other people how to use these new skills that are ambiguous to most people creating it and people using it at the same time.
I would say we have our own development pipeline, which is something that's been true for like every company that I've worked at in the last 30 years. And we make that available sometimes to partners like Noah, actually. And so there's always a process of kind of getting people used to using that tool set. And I think that's probably actually harder than getting them used to asking the questions about designing voice UI. So we can sort of go to the same talent pool of people that we've been using all this time. It's just kind of, there's always an onboarding process, and the VUI thing is an extra one.
So as voice applications become more prevalent, what does that mean for companies in terms of their content creation processes? What sort of impacts do you foresee there?
As the tech evolves, it's going to get harder. Things are going to get harder. Things are going to get more complicated, I think, because I think one of the big things that's going to come down the pike eventually is better natural language processing. And this is going to be great. This is going to be great for all of us, because now, instead of understanding what we say, computers will understand what we mean, or they probably won't, but they'll be faking it a lot better than they are now. Like I think you guys are probably in on the, like, we have giant amounts of data, we have some neural networks that are gonna sort through all this stuff for it, and we're gonna get the computer kind of do a best guess algorithm on what the idea is instead of what the sentence was. And that's going to mean like a big sea change for everybody who's designing for it. We're going to have to learn to talk to each other and to software in terms of ideas instead of in terms of words. And that's going to kind of complicate things, but it's going to be awesome.
I think it's actually really exciting. So you used to have to say to your computer, I'm in San Francisco, 94115, what's the weather? Today you can just say, hey, what's the weather? And I think that's really exciting, but it does, to your point, to your earlier question, have a ton of implications for content. So how are you now I think, like, I work with a ton of news publishers, I work with recipe publishers, and they're constantly thinking about how their content gets surfaced in these new modalities, essentially. And I think it's a really interesting challenge because we can understand some of the content that they have, but it's also an exciting and hard challenge because they have to think through new ways to create content. So the New York Times, for example, let's say they're creating daily news briefs. They're now forced to kind of like reinvent the wheel. What could be really exciting for users, we now have a different expectation of our technology, right? You used to say 94115, and now you just say, what's the weather? You have a different user expectation. So I think we're also putting the onus on our content providers and our publishers and our TV shows and movies and all these things to actually step up their game as well in terms of being interactive, voice first, and a lot more immersive.
Yeah, and in addition to content, which traditionally we might think of stories or conversations, but what's unique about voice is that they're sounds. So sound and how you say things and how the intonations and all of that kind of adds to the content piece as well of the design.
Yeah, and that's a real challenge for us who, video company, to work with an interface with no visual aspect to it. So we really have to think about, what are the interesting parts of this content that we're heavily investing in for a TV show that we can extract and sort of extend to a new platform. And it doesn't always work, and there's a temptation to like, can we make a Vikings skill that has interesting things about Vikings? But I think it's more about like extending this sort of ethos of the brand. And we're lucky to have a brand called History that has such a rich area to explore on every surface. But for brands that don't have that, and like other brand is Lifetime, so like what do you do for Lifetime? And they speak a lot to women, so could we do something with bringing to life inspirational women's quotations every day? You really have to get more creative and diversify how you think about content creation.
I was just going to, oh, sorry, go ahead. I think that, so imagine your favorite store. 10 years ago, you used to walk into the store, and if your favorite associate was there, that's how you remembered that brand, right? Like there's a specific, so Bloomingdale's is a great store that I love. I walk in there, I have a feeling, I have a memory of the brand in my head. And that used to be the way that you remember a brand, right? That they had a physical footprint. The world has completely changed now. We have websites that are the biggest digital footprint for a brand today. And now, obviously, these voice platforms give someone yet another voice and persona. But I think this is another extension of your brand where you actually really have to be careful about thinking through that persona. So the way that you used to look at your sales associate, and that was a kind of like the face of that brand, you now have an opportunity to take that voice, put it somewhere else, and actually distribute it to millions of people instead of just the one person standing in front of you in a store. So while that's really, I think, complex and you need to be really thoughtful about it, it's also really, really cool because you can have this opportunity to create a new voice. If something in your brand was potentially stale before, you now have a way to create this new persona and a new personality, which I think is really cool.
I think the user expectation point is very interesting. My mother has an Echo. I gave it to her, and she says she's always said, "Thank you, Alexa," and she even yells at Alexa sometimes when Alexa doesn't understand. I'm like, "Mom, come on, there's nobody there. She can't hear you," but she still does it, and I think it's because this is so new. People are expecting a certain sort of empathy, or if that's the word. As the technology becomes more conversational, and you can actually, digital assistants can sense whether you're upset or angry. What does that mean for application development? It sounds like that would be a really interesting opportunity to really build, to get your users really coming back for more.
That's why you should be nice to your Google Home and your Alexa.
No, actually, the issue of kids talking to these devices is, all kidding aside, is a very serious thing because I've taught mine to actually think that they are a person. Otherwise, they're just very rude to it.
And super demanding, right? Because right now, similar to just like saying chatbots, where people are using it as keyword searches versus conversation. So then if we're doing that with voice as well, then it's quite demanding. Say, play music without asking the Alexa or Google Home to play a certain song for you, or even say thank you. I feel like it is like where you're saying how if our children, our younger generation, are learning to speak to these devices like something that would just respond to certain commands, I wonder how they would start speaking with real humans.
I used to, in a previous life, I made these adventure games that were based on these really kind of cryptic puzzles that the users had to solve. And one of the big things that we always had to figure out was how are we going to do help functions for this. We wanted it to be kind of as seamless as possible, and we spent years sort of trying to get the games to sort of understand when help was needed and just sort of provide it. And if the assistant is listening to me and can tell when I'm getting upset, that's a great tool for that.
I can tell their dialogue flow is also getting much better at understanding certain nuances when actually communicating with the user, whether it be a child or an adult. If you actually, let's say, pause after every single interaction, it'll ingest that and say, like, why is that person pausing? And then it can actually repeat back potentially a sound and say, like, why are you getting stuck? Or try to better understand those kinds of nuances, because I think what we can inherit or understand as those nuances, like a pause or a sound or a hum, are very obvious to us, but it's not necessarily so easy for a machine to interpret. But I think that technology is actually getting a lot better and will make for much better conversational design, so that way you're not getting stuck in certain parts of those decision trees anymore.
Even in our experience for both like Messenger and Google Assistant, we would recognize profanity or anything that sounds like negative feedback, or someone just doesn't like certain things, and we would respond to it. And especially if you were being disrespectful to the bot, then we would respond with a message as well. We would try to understand all of those kind of feelings.
That all sounds very complicated. Social cues, especially when AI is at the stage where, I mean, how far, I mean, just a guess, how many years are we away from AI digital assistants being able to understand social cues in a conversation?
Not far.
Really?
Awesome.
You need designers.
There are certain things that you can do today with the assistant and with Dialogflow where they can actually understand pauses. They can understand when, like, certain things like that are possible today. So I don't think it's that far off. And the means in which we can compute a lot of this is really advanced over the past few years.
Yeah, I think like I was just trying to mention that you need people to think about those use cases so that we can actually build that into the responses. Because say if we don't think of those use cases of like understanding emotions, then we won't actually build it, right? Yeah.
Are there any questions? I've got, yes.
Can you just speak into the mic for your question?
So I'm a product manager, and I want my users to be able to visually scan and click, speak phrases, type phrases, go back and forth between them within the same application at the same time, basically have an integrated experience. What, besides advances in NLP that are needed, of course, what's standing in the way of something like that existing? Is it technology? Is it market? Is it tools availability?
I don't know. Nothing.
I think when you say integrated experiences, do you mean, let's say you're building an app for an assistant and you want it to be able to have type, text, voice, visual interactions? Are you asking how that can get integrated together, or are you asking how that experience can be integrated with other applications?
Yeah, thanks. So again, I'm a software product manager. With all due respect, I don't care about the things that you're talking about. What I care about,
Cool.
What I care about are my users. The people who are giving me money to buy my application. So I want to give them the best experience possible, and that best experience now, based on where technology is going, it might be visually scan and click, it might be typing in text, it might be saying text, but I want that all to be integrated so that they can interact with my application any way they want. And I think that in the same way that you have web tools, you have, that people can, libraries people can bring in, developers can bring in. And then for separate devices, like the Echo, like the Home, there are tools that developers can use. When is all that going to be integrated into, one platform, a web application or what have you? Or is that just a dream and that's not on the agenda?
Answer.
Thanks for the great talk, by the way. I think the answer to your question is the technology is there, but there's no roadmap as how to redesign the architecture of your content, because you have to reformat your content to make it high intensity, to have the right technology to stitch these pieces of content together, to show it, to render it as a piece of text, as an image with some text, as a voice, or a combination of all these, depending on which modality you're using.
Yeah, I mean, I think the technology is there. Alexa skills run as a web service. If you can establish a user's identity, it's pretty easy to move them across platforms too. So we were thinking about like a history homework helper that you could start with your voice, say I'm reading a term paper on War of 1812, and then have that represent in a web browser of a bunch of links that you could move then to a chatbot that could then continue on that research. So I think the tech is there. It's just doing that hasn't been at the forefront, I think, of a lot of developers' minds.
And you could roll your own too. The first version of Earplay was built 5 years ago, and we used open source voice recognition technology behind that. It's hard to maintain it yourself, but you can do it.
Hi, I'm Jeff Perone. I'm a voice user interface designer, and one of the things that intrigues me is this idea when we talk about, well, maybe the next application is selling stuff. And you know, your comment, Dave, I thought about basically modeling a shop clerk rather than thinking about it as some online app now. I think one of the key aspects of that is if you really want it to work as a voice interaction and you're not going to present somebody with a list of 50 things, you need to trust the app. So it needs to know a lot about you. So in order for it to find out a lot about you, you need to trust it. Then it can use that information to give you, you know, like a best friend might tell you, oh, here's a movie you'll like, or here's 2 movies that you probably really like. I'm just wondering what you think about the role of trust in this new age of voice.
Trust takes a long time to build. My last studio was one that started in 2004 with the idea that we were going to take advantage of the emerging downloadable space for games. And we were kind of following on the heels of people starting to download all their music. And we thought, that'll work great for games. It's bigger file size, but the time is just about right for it. And we spent years just trying to get people to trust us enough to give us their money to buy something that didn't exist, even though they were already used to doing that with songs. It was kind of a whole new ballgame with now you're going to do this with your games too. And I think there's we're facing a similar uphill battle now, I think, in the voice space with like trust, not just about your money, but about anything, your data, your everything.
I think from my perspective, there's 2 big components to trust, and I've seen this in various roles here at Google. I think one big piece of it is user experience. So you want to trust that this platform that knows so much about you won't just spam you with things or send you proactive notifications or give you an experience just to sell ads against it. So user experience is a huge piece. And then I think the second piece of it is just PII, so trusting that if you are engaging with these platforms and you are searching or using maps or any of these things that we're very, very public about how we use that data today, that you trust that they're protecting it and that there are mechanisms in place to actually protect that data. So I think those are the 2 big components of it. But I think more than that, it's just about trusting the ethos a lot of a company and trusting the leadership. And I can tell you that I've worked across a ton of different products here at Google, from Google Plus, which of course is like the backbone of lots of your data on the Google side, to our ads business, which of course has a lot of deep pockets with your data. I think that it's really important for platforms to be honest and transparent and really, really care about taking hardcore steps to protect lots of that data. And I feel really passionately, it's why I've stayed at Google for a long time, that we do take those steps to gain that trust, which I think, to be transparent, without that trust, any platform or technology is a little bit moot in today's day and age. It's really easy to lose it.
Can we do a quick audience poll thing? Show of hands. How many of you have an assistant of some kind in your home? How many of you turn them off sometimes? Yeah, okay, so maybe a third. Yeah. Trust.
How many of you are worried that it's listening before the wake word happens?
I think that was the same.
Everything's listening to it's hard to just turn off one device because you have multiple devices. So just leave it on, I guess. So something's listening to someone, or.
I think we have time for 2 more questions. So there's one over there.
Hey there, I'm Chad Oda, and I work on enterprise implementations for conversational user interfaces. And I think, to all your points, user experience is really the focal point for all these engagements that we're trying to create. This may be sort of a preemptive question, but I think a lot of us are interested about standardization and best practices in regards to user experience. Have you guys seen any best practices that you guys would recommend in developing either on voice or on sort of chatbot specifically?
Everything we're doing at Earplay. Just play our stuff and follow it.
And I really just think it's getting the user experience as right as you can, and then working with the constraints that each platform currently has. And I think we'll start to see those flatten out over the next short time. But there are still idiosyncrasies between Google and Alexa and other surfaces. So I think it's just a fact of life until we all kind of come to a common understanding of what a good VUI looks like and what a good interaction looks like, or sounds like.
It's hard to generalize about this stuff because the use cases are all so different. But if you have to, I think fast, simple, and clear are the things you go for.
I would agree. It definitely really depends by use case. So if you think of a news publisher, it's really different from how a recipe publisher might interact with the user versus an apparel brand, et cetera. So I think it really does depend by use case. But I think something that's really important here is that it's not just like a one and done kind of thing. So you don't build an app, ship it off, and then it just goes. I think we do a ton of user testing internally on the Google side with our first party applications on the Assistant. And then also, I think it's a great mechanism to use on your end as well for building for any platform, whether it's Amazon or Google, to just keep iterating and learning from your data. So if one thing isn't working or you see that users are getting stuck, how do you continue to iterate on that? Because of course every app and experience should be a little bit different.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Do you guys remember designing mobile first? I like to say design voice first for the same reasons of just cutting through the clutter and just getting straight to the point of what your experience and what your value prop is.
I think we have time for one more question. Maybe, okay, over there.
Hi. So when it comes to keeping data secure, what do you think of the future of marketing with voice technology?
I'm like, what am I allowed to say?
I'll just go for it.
No, I think, listen, we have to be really careful about how we even talk about monetization on these platforms. I think a few weeks ago I think it was CES or South by, where we actually announced that you can, a user can opt into proactive notifications. So I think that we are so careful about figuring out how to market against some of this data, figuring how to market in some of these apps, like in-app experiences. I think we're really careful about it. We're taking it really slowly. We're being really thoughtful. I can tell you that at the highest level of our product teams at Google, it's a really sensitive and careful matter. But of course, we want to be able to provide the best user experiences. So that's what it's all rooted in, whether it's monetizable or not. That's kind of like our true north.
Okay, I think that's all we have time for right now. I'd like to thank our panel for all the insightful feedback.